It's Father's Day in our land, and as in the case with many of our holidays, it is not in any way linked to our lectionary schedule of the Episcopal Church. It is good to remember this as we have a Father Abraham story that does not provide an example of what a good father should be like. Abraham, as a being made in the image of God, is a critical step into living into God's hope. When you compare him to Noah, God's earlier model example, the difference between them is striking. Noah dutifully did everything that God told him to do without ever saying a word. At God's command, he saved only himself, his family, and the animal resources needed to restart the world, while the rest of life was destroyed by a flood. He stayed locked away in his ark while everything died and while the stench of decay remained. Once God chose him, he did nothing of his own free will that demonstrated what it means to be made in the image of God. While Abraham, then called Abram, began in similar fashion, going where God told him to go, he did so in different context. While Noah was told that he would be saved as others perished, Abram was told that he would be a blessing for all, that all the families of the earth shall be blessed. But when this did not seem to be happening, he did not remain silent. "You've given me no offspring," challenging God's actions. And rather than getting smited, look how God responds to Abram. God brought him outside and said, "Look towards heaven and count the stars if you are able to count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Abram continued to question how God was making things happen, while at the same time following God's instructions. In a treasured moment, the man renamed Abraham showed great insight and hospitality to three men of God by the oaks of Mamre, where Sarah laughs and the promise of a son is finally set in motion. And then comes what is arguably Abraham's finest hour, when he argues with God, not for himself, but for the sake of others who would have been easily seen as expendable. Learning from God of the plans to destroy Sodom, Abraham argues like the finest of lawyers that God's plans to destroy the people are unjust and unworthy. When you read the whole story in Genesis 18, one gets the feeling that the only reason everyone wasn't spared was because God fled the scene before Abraham could pose the obvious reason. All this illustrates, again, a critical change in the evolution of humanity. The beings made in the likeness of God were starting to live into their promise. Abraham, critically, is still a flawed person. He does not see women as equal, be it his wife Sarah, who he uses to protect himself in heinous ways, or her slave girl Hagar, who he uses to conceive a child. And he's also a terrible father. Yes, Father Abraham refers to linking Abraham to three religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But as far as being a father to his actual children, Abraham is a disaster. The best known debacle is the story referred to as the sacrifice of Isaac. One could say the story demonstrates Abraham's devotion to God, his willingness to kill his own son at God's command. But the injustice towards Isaac himself is undeniable. Abraham belongs in jail for attempted murder, and Isaac destined for years of therapy. I wonder if, looking with the lens of time, we can conclude that Abraham failed this test of God. In his willingness to kill Isaac, Abraham is rewarded with things God had already promised. The one addition is this: your offspring shall possess the gates of their enemies. What if this was not what God hoped for in Abraham's legacy? Possessing gates means being an occupying force. The people whose gate one possesses remains their enemies. What if God wanted Abraham to say no to the command to sacrifice Isaac? No, God, I am yours. Do with my life what you will, but I will not sacrifice my innocent son. Maybe the endless cycle of possessing gates of enemies would have been transformed into people being enemies no longer. Regardless, Abraham failed his son Isaac. And in today's reading, Abraham fails his other son, Ishmael, along with his mother Hagar. Abraham does what he knows is wrong, casting them out at Sarah's urging. In an earlier version of the story, Abraham is even worse, completely shirking his responsibility to them and showing no hesitation. Your slave girl is in your power. Do with her as you please. Do to her as you please. The Reverend Dr. Mary Brennan Thorpe writes that Abraham silently thinks, I'm not to blame for my misdeeds. I did what I had to do. I did what Sarah pushed me to do. I did what helped keep me alive, helped keeping my heritage alive. This is the justification of one who seeks to keep his power rather than to do what is right. Abraham is wrong, no matter if he's seen as righteous, even if God uses the moment to bless Ishmael. Hearing the failures of Father Abraham brings us to the inflicted members of the story. Rather than focus on the good that is promised for them, we must remember the pain and injustice as well, as a story that speaks to those marginalized in our own time. Again, Reverend Thorpe writes, I wonder if Hagar had nightmares. Nightmares of being forced to lie with her master. Nightmares of death by heat exposure and thirst, even after finding her new life in Paran. I wonder if Ishmael remembered the little brother he played with, who ended up with all the love of the father who loved Ishmael less. I wonder if the pain, the humiliation, the loss, the separation, the bitterness stayed with them. And who could blame them? We do not hear the voices of Hagar and Ishmael again, but there are voices in their heads, and those voices do not go silent. They do not let them escape the pain. There are voices within the heads of those who are suffering now as Hagar and Ishmael suffered, and their pain now demands those voices speak aloud. It is not for us to speak. Their voices have waited too long. Speak pain. Speak truth. Speak change. Speak. Amen.